Today's hearing on Russia's malign influence in the Western Hemisphere is increasingly pertinent in light of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Since the beginning of the invasion, Putin's influence has only grown in Latin America and the Caribbean. Many governments on all sides of the ideologic spectrum have failed to address Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For instance, El Salvador was one of the countries that abstained from a UN vote condemning Russia's invasion, and Mexico's president has consistently telegraphed his neutrality. Worse, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela shamelessly supported Putin ahead of the invasion. Even more concerning, today, no country has implemented sanctions against Putin, his cronies, or Russia's war machine. This is truly disappointing. One of the ways in which Russia exercises its malign influence in the region is through its Spanish-language version of Russia Today, also known as RT. This propaganda outlet operates in almost every Latin American and Caribbean country. In addition to Moscow-controlled Sputnik News, RT spreads anti-American disinformation and false flag narratives to justify Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Russia has also turned to the region in an effort to dodge Western sanctions. The U.S. intelligence community's 2022 annual threat assessment states that Russia has, quote, expanded its engagement with Venezuela, supported Cuba, and used arms sales and energy agreements to try to expand access to markets and natural resources in Latin America, in part to offset some of the effects of sanctions, end quote. Russia has even gone so far as to threaten the possibility of sending military assets to Latin America if the United States and our allies do not halt our assistance to Ukraine. This is unacceptable. In its 2022 posture statement, Southcom asserts that Russia is among the secondary external threats in the Western Hemisphere, with China being the primary threat. Southcom states that Russia, and I quote, intensifies instability through its ties with Venezuela, entrenchment in Cuba and Nicaragua, and extensive disinformation operations, end quote. The oppressive regimes of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are without doubt the largest sources of instability in the region, and they all have Russian and Chinese ties. In fact, the U.S. commander of NORTHCOM recently revealed that our neighbor Mexico has the largest number of Russian intelligence officers. Meanwhile, our southern border remains wide open. Congress cannot stand idly by while the Russian and the Chinese regimes ramp up their malign activities in the region. For too long, the Western Hemisphere has taken a back seat in U.S. foreign policy. We've seen the disastrous consequences of this, from China's debt trap diplomacy to Taiwan's growing diplomatic isolation, to Russia's arms sales and military engagement, to rising instability and surging migration. The absence of American leadership in our hemisphere has created a vacuum, and this vacuum has been filled by Russia and China. Congress must act. The administration must act. As a House Armed Services Committee member, I'm proud of securing several of my key priorities in the House-passed FY 2023 NDAA. One of these priorities includes my amendment requiring a Department of Defense report addressing Russia's malign activity in Latin America and the Caribbean. Uncovering these activities will help policymakers better address them and will shed light on Russia's hostile actions. As ranking member of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, I introduced a bipartisan piece of legislation, the Western Hemisphere Nearshoring Act, with the assistance of Chairman Cirrus and his staff. This legislation would offer Latin America and Caribbean countries an alternative to China's debt trap diplomacy and Russia's backhanded deals. By nearshoring manufacturing jobs from China to our hemisphere, we can reduce our region's dependence on China and increase economic opportunity. It's a big step towards re-engaging with our southern neighbors, economically, politically, and diplomatically. And I want to take a moment and thank the State Department for their bipartisan assistance in writing this legislation. I ask all of my colleagues to co-sponsor this common sense legislation and would respectfully urge Chairman Meeks to schedule the bill for markup soon. In closing, Mr. Chairman, it's unthinkable that in a region where nearly every single country was a signatory in the Inter-American Democratic Charter, we're witnessing so many democratic partners ignoring Russia's horrific human rights violations. The Charter solidified the region's commitment to democratic norms and principles. Our partners cannot continue ignoring Putin's malign and destabilizing behavior. Again, I want to deeply thank Chairman Sears for holding this important hearing, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. Thank you, and I yield. I really want to say, first off, to all of our witnesses today, this has just been fantastic testimony. And I thank each of you for what you've shared. Looked at your written statements prior, they're detailed. I'm very grateful for your efforts today. In March 22, General Glenn Van Herrick, the commander of NORTHCOM, testified before the Senate that Mexico is among the top countries worldwide with regard to the number of Russian intel guys, basically spies, operating in its territory. How should the United States view these activities in respect to our relationship with Mexico and Russia's relationship with Mexico? And I throw that out there to anyone. Perhaps Mr. Ellis, yes, please.
Yes, Ranking Member Green, thank you very much. I think, first of all, of course, this is something that has historically been the case all the way back to the Cold War, the presence of Russian intelligence operatives, Soviet operatives in Mexico, but it certainly illustrates Russia's recognition of the strategic value of Mexico that close to the U.S. border. I think it also illustrates, without implicating, any Mexican knowledge or collusion in this, first, the difficult foreign policy, and we've seen an increasing turn to the left, not only with AMLO, but also Foreign Minister Ebrard, as well as some of the very real concerns of activity by a variety of different groups, especially the expanding power of Sinaloa and Jalisco Nueva Generación and other cartels. There's really just a sea of opportunity for Russian illicit actors as well as others to swim in desperately close to our U.S. shore. And I certainly welcome more attention to where things are at with the governability of the Mexican regime and its relationship and the posture of AMLO toward the U.S. And the importance of our cooperation on security affairs that directly affect the U.S. through ties of economics, migration, family, and security.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I agree with Dr. Evan Ellis about the importance of paying closer attention to this kind of the activities. I'm afraid many Latin American governments have been reluctant to pay sufficient attention to what Russia's intelligence services have been doing in this part of the world. For example, in Colombia, they eventually managed to identify some of the intelligence activities. But till then, Russian diplomats, Russian intelligence officer using the cover of diplomatic posts were almost openly doing such kind of activities everywhere. And it's also very important to take into consideration that differently, for example, to European countries, in Latin America, Russian diplomatic post, and Russia has stable diplomatic relation with all Latin American and the Caribbean countries, and they have embassies and consulate throughout the entire region. So these diplomatic posts have been actually doing a lot of things that are not exactly correspond to what the diplomatic activities are. They have been involved in intelligence, they have been involved in disinformation, especially taking into account the fact that in some of the countries, the access to RT, Actualidad, and Sputnik Mundo had been reduced. So they now reinforce their diplomatic post to continue this disinformation campaign. So I think it's important to pay attention to this. Thank you.
So maybe perhaps in writing, if the two of you would send what you think our recommended actions should be, that would be helpful. And I'll let you respond in writing to my office. And we'll get that in the record. Real quickly, because I'm almost out of time, anyone can take this question on. A little concerned about what Russia's doing in Nicaragua with the global positioning system, that the observation satellite. Could someone address that briefly? Perhaps Dr. Ellis, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, While it is a legitimate facility to relate to GLONASS, it also creates other electronic capture opportunities and opportunities for Russian space personnel coordinating with Nicaraguans to operate in the region for other purposes. And so, even though it's legitimate, it does open up the door for certain risks, especially ELINT type of risks.
It's an ISR platform, is basically what you're saying.
For capture as well as for the personnel that allows it to work in the region under the cover of that facility.
Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time, but I know Ms. Martin wanted to answer that. Is it okay if she does? Hey, you're muted, Mr. Chairman.
How dare they? You're recognized.
Go ahead, Ms. Martin.
Dr. Martin.
Thank you. I would just agree with what the previous speaker said and add that the Nicaraguan facility is different from the Brazilian facilities, which are open to use by scientists. The one in Nicaragua is closed. It probably is engaged in local spying activity from the installation, as well as things that are related to space-based intelligence collection, just because it is dominated by Russia in an area that is very close to the U.S. Embassy.